Hello everyone, my name is Hidayaturrahman. Will explain about making globalization more inclusive with my partner Shafitri Arindya. Over the last 50 years, the remarkable opening and integration of the world economy, in combination with the rapid pace of technological change, has contributed to raising the living standards of billions of people around the world, including some of the poorest ones. But this process of globalization has necessarily been accompanied by economic change, churn, and uh, displacement as laborers, together with other factors of production shift from declining industries to expanding ones. Developing countries have become increasingly integrated into the world economy. Overall, the impact of trade opening or technological change on labor markets, including workers' job opportunities and earnings, depends on the workers' place of residence, sectors of employment, firm, or even occupation. Individual characteristics, including skills, are also important as older workers are traditionally less mobile than younger workers. And also, globalization greatly contributes to the changing nature of jobs that are demanded by firms. So, in this section, we'll discuss the reviews of the literature from Emmanuel Millet on labor market policies used to facilitate the trade-induced adjustment. We begin with adjustment to literature review. Globalization is the integration of goods, services, financial, and capital markets on a world scale. From the perspective of firms, this integration means having access to broader markets but also facing tougher competition. In order to remain competitive in global markets, firms have to adjust by engaging in innovation, developing new products, and also adopting new technologies. They must also adjust by adapting their workforce to the new competitive environment. Such adjustment is costly, however, and workers bear a large share of the cost of adjustment to globalization. And then, what do we mean by adjustment? The need for adjustment occurs whenever an economy is hit by a shock that changes the setting in which it functions. Indeed, this change in the setting in which the economy functions will induce adjustment that correspond to a reallocation of resource to different use. An adjustment can also be costly. However, when this reallocation is not smooth and immediate, it typically takes time to reallocate resources according to the new condition, and the longer it takes, the higher mobility cost, the adjustment cost will be much higher. One way of measuring adjustment cost is to look at the production that is foregone during the transition period. And then, should government facilitate adjustment? So government are deeply concerned with facilitating adjustment regardless of what is causing it. The mere existence of unemployment insurance is a striking example of this. In the countries from Asia, Africa, and also Latin America, government force workers and firms to contribute a fund that is then used to provide wage insurance to unemployed workers, such as safety net, is an important component of the modern welfare state. In fact, government intervention is necessary as a way to legitimize international economic integration. Considering adjustment caused by international trade, arguments in favor of specific type of government intervention falls into three categories, such as economic efficiencies, fairness, and political support. The argument for economic efficiency states that in the presence of mobility costs, government should facilitate adjustment and speed up the transition towards efficient allocation of resources. And the argument for fairness is while all consumers gain from international trade through lower price, The cost is borne by a small number of workers. If workers are displaced um, because of the government trade policy, it is only fair that they are compensated for it. The argument for political support states that government should compensate those who are adversely affected by its own action. For instance, if lowering tariff generates job losses and government do nothing about it, public support for further tariff reduction is likely to be low. The next part is adjustment policies. Policies aimed at helping workers adjust to the impact of trade or technological change can provide a helping hand to the workforce and increase the benefits of open trade and new technology. This publication contributes to the discussion on how government can help make international trade more inclusive and ensure that the benefits of open trade are spread more widely. Some countries have additional programs specifically direct at workers who become unemployed because of international trade of globalization in general. This trade assistance program has often been implemented during or after the signing of major free trade agreements or in more general recognition that globalization directly affects the labor market and require a political response to ensure that trade liberalization is accepted by the general public. There is no one fits policy that will miraculously bring about full employment, no matter where or when it is applied. However, systematic steps should be taken by policymakers when designing policies aiming at helping workers adversely affected by globalization or any other type of shock such as technological. A second crucial step is to identify the reason for policy intervention. Careful identification of the particular shock the policy should address is of utmost importance. So, in this part, we're going to talk about globalization, flexicurity, and adult vocational training in Burma. We begin with the flexicurity and the Danish uh, labor market. This section briefly outlines the main characteristics of the Danish labor market, including the so-called flexicurity model, the wage structure, the extent of active labor market policies, and adult training programs. The flexicurity model is organized around three main pillars. First, there's a relative low level of employment protection as Danish firms have the lowest level of difficulty among Asian, African, and also American Latin countries dismissing permanent workers. And statutory severance payments are relatively low. As a result, average job tenure time spent in the job is among the lowest in Europe. However, working against these are relative long notification periods where firms must consult with trade unions during larger layoff events. One aim of this negotiation is to agree on measures to restrain uh, workers such that adjustment into new job is eased. The second pillar in the Danish flex security model is relatively generous unemployment insurance benefits and social assistance for displaced workers. The majority of workers are members of unemployment insurance funds, which allow them to receive unemployment insurance benefits. So these benefits amount to an average investment rate of 74% of their previous wage. The third pillar is healthy resilience on activate labor market policies intended to strengthen job search, effort, and upgrade skills. To receive income support during unemployment, workers must participate in activation measures such as private or public job training or enrollment in classroom training. And then we'll talk about adult vocational training in Denmark. So Denmark has a long tradition of continued training and educational of its adult workforce. In a flexible labor market like the Danish one, where it is easy to fire workers whose skills have been made obsolete by globalization or new technology, it is crucial for workers to be able to continuously upgrade their skill set through the working life cycle. The high degree of training participation in Denmark is supported by generous training subsidies from the government. In data that is obtained from the course participant register, the Danish training subsidies are heavily tilted toward vocational training course in terms of number of participants. In 2010, more than 420,000 workers participated in adult vocational training course. However, the vocational training courses are fairly small, and the total training activity is evenly distributed among basic, vocational, and post-secondary courses. And finally, I have examined whether training participation help solve restructuring and adaptation problems in the labor market by reviewing the findings from a small number of studies of the effect of training on workers' employment and earning. And vocational training is found to increase employment rates and earnings, but these vocational training participants tend to have their attachment to initial industries and occupation reinforced. This is mirrored in a study on how training interacts with increase of soaring. Vocationally trained workers from firms with increasing of soaring are more likely to be employed in manufacturing, to work in the service sector. Post-secondary training also increases employment and earnings, and many of these courses allow workers to move to better jobs in new occupation. However, these courses are not increasingly used by workers exposed to offshoring. So this section is about enforcement of labor regulation and the labor market effect of trade evidence from Brazil. We begin with the trade liberalization episode in Brazil. Brazil was characterized by a complex system of protection against foreign competition that include both tariff and non-tariff barriers. Nominal tariff did not represent the de facto level of protection faced by industries in the country. This trade liberalization episode was a non-reciprocal process in which the country substantially increased its exposure to foreign competition without any gains in market access abroad. But from the perspective of home market, this trade reform potentially represent a substantial negative labor demand shock in regions that had a larger fraction of their labor force employed in industries that observe larger tariff reduction relative to regions that had a large fraction of their employment in industries less affected. And the next is labor regulation and enforcement. In Brazil, the permissible types of labor contracts, their conditions and terms for termination are completely regulated by the CLT. As part of the labor regulation in Brazil, all former workers are required to hold a work booklet issued by the Ministry of their labor. This booklet must be signed by the employer and contains a worker's entire formal labor history. Having this formal labor contract entitles workers to a series of benefits such as the 13 monthly salary, unemployment insurance, severance payment, 1 month paid vacation, and at least 50% premium for overtime hours. The next part is about German employment legislation and its impact on the trade and labor market nexus. The German government started to transform the labor market legislation at the beginning of the 21st century by giving particular enterprise more flexibility in hiring and firing their employees as part of an in-depth labor market reform program. Other adjustments included lower unemployment benefit and various active labor market policies. Consequently, unemployment rates in Germany were plummeting shortly after the enforcement of the reforms. Today, Germany's rate of unemployment is at a record low level of 3.4%, which is the second lowest rate in the European Union. To some extent, this success is an achievement that can be attributed to the rigorous labor market reforms. However, these reforms were not only source of labor market turmoil in recent decades. Declining transportation costs due to technological progress, accession of the People's Republic of China to the World Trade Organization led to soaring volumes of both import and export. Firms' international activities were on the increase through an increasing number of exporting firms and higher trade volumes for already exporting firms. The rise of emerging economies such as China magnified the pressure perceived by incumbent firms in more labor-intensive industries. The next is theoretical consideration on the trade and employment protection nexus. There are several opposing effects of trade on the labor market, and it may be important to distinguish between final and intermediate goods such as final goods import, intermediate goods import, total effect of imports, and the effect of employment protection.
Hello, I'm Shafitri. I will continue to talk about the next four topics. The first topic is about the Republic of Korea's trade adjustment policies and their effects on labor market adjustment. The Republic of Korea has been actively opening its market since the early 90s, making its first bilateral trade agreement with Chile effective from 3rd April 2004. It has since arranged such agreements with 52 countries that now cover more than 77% of the world's GDP. Given the little progress made in multilateral negotiations under the Doha Development Agenda, much of the progress in market liberalization has taken the form of regional trade agreements. It has been through an extensive network of these arrangements with partners such as the EU, the US, and the People's Republic of China that the Korean government has been pursuing sustained growth. Despite Korea's overall success in wide trade liberalization, the adverse effects may have been severe for selected agriculture and manufacturing industries that had to face increasing competition from abroad. To address these concerns, the government had adopted the so-called Trade Adjustment Assistance or TAA program, named after that of the US, aimed to absorb the negative shocks on firms and workers in import competing sectors. However, the AA program does not benefit workers much. The main type of aid is subsidized loans to firms, while direct aid to affected workers comprises less than 1.5% of total aid. For continued market liberalizations to be a sustainable policy option for Korea, the country should adopt more robust TAA programs to provide organized support that targets displaced workers directly. An important structural feature of Korea's labor market is its dualism. While other countries roughly divide workers into full-time and part-time, the country is special in that it divides workers into regular and non-regular. Across A crucial factor distinguishing the two groups is the degree of legal protections and related stability they have. Non-regular workers can be further divided according to their type of contract and part-time status. Korea's Ministry of Employment and Labor makes the following official classification: first, temporary worker; second, part-time workers; and third, atypical workers. Among temporary workers, fixed-term workers are those who are hired by a contract for a predetermined period without renewal, while open-ended contract workers can be rehired by renewal of the contract. Part-time workers are those who work fewer than 30 hours in a week. Atypical workers are defined as those who are paid by their performance without a fixed salary, fixed working hours, or fixed working location. The fundamental reason behind this dualism and the wage gap is the the differing degree of legal protection. Because of the heavy protection for regular full-time workers, only those who must work part-time or must forego employees' benefits to be competitive in the market work as non-regular workers, that is, men and women, the young and old and less educated at wage discount. Regular workers demand heavy legal protection that preserve the systematic dualism because if they were fired, they would be on their own and it is difficult to get a new regular job position. Therefore, a proper TIA system, a form of safety net in response to trade liberalization, can help lessen labor dualism. The absence of one would worsen the existing duality, especially if trade liberalization has been impairing domestic employment. Among Korea's passive labor market policies, a form of social safety net supporting unemployed workers in their job search, the most representative is the Employment Insurance Program, which is integrated with active labor policies under the country's Employment Insurance System, or EIS, in place since 1995, which includes employment promotion policies and job training programs, as well as unemployment allowances. Unemployment benefits are covered by insurance schemes for which the premium is jointly paid by workers and employers. Active Active labor market policies designed by the Korean government to reduce unemployment and promote re-employment can be categorized into two groups: employment stabilization programs and vocational skills development programs. Employment stabilization programs consist of three sub-programs. First, Job Creation Program, which provides financial support for jobs newly created by firms through work shift, job sharing, and reduction of working hours. Second, Employment Adjustment Program, which provides subsidies to firms that retain workers during a temporary shutdown. And third, Employment Promotion Program, which provides subsidies for the employment of disadvantaged workers. Meanwhile, vocational skills development programs aim to provide opportunities for continuing education to enable workers to remain competitive and employed in the evolving labor market. Korea has arranged bilateral FTAs with 16 partners by the end of 2018. Among them, that with China is the biggest, followed by that with the EU and that with the US. Negotiation with the US began in 2006 and agreement was reached within a year in April 2007. The coverage and depth of the FTAs with the US and the EU were similar, as the former served as the benchmark for the latter. While the KORUS and EU FTAs are similar in content, as noted above, the KORUS FTA took much longer to be ratified than that with the EU. Besides that, fact that its negotiation had started earlier, the FTA with US was much more politicized as it involved complex domestic conflict between conservatives whose support was based on Korea's longtime military alliance with US and liberals who criticized it as an infringement of Korea's sovereignty. On the contrary, the FTA with China was ratified without any serious socio-political debate because the Korean government made almost no concessions on opening the agricultural sector, while China allowed no significant market opening in the manufacturing sector. On the whole, the majority of enterprises in the manufacturing sector have been considered to be the possible beneficiaries of the FTAs, and the country needs reliable unemployment aid and re-employment training measures that specifically target workers in import-competing sectors. In Korea's dual-track system of trade adjustment assistance, the first track is a bottom-up system, a conventional TAA. The program was first established by the 2006 Act on Trade Adjustment Assistance following free trade agreements, mainly to support SMEs that are negatively affected by FTAs selected based on their applications. The second track of Korea's Trade Adjustment Assistance System, Domestic Support Policies, which has mechanism for the assistance that takes the form of a top-down system. The TAA program is not doing as much to protect firms and workers as we initially advertised, while domestic support policies have been somewhat more effective than the TAA program. The second topic is about higher education response to India's IT boom. The contributions of information technology to India's GDP increased from 1.2% in 1997 to 9.3% in 2015. Currently, more than 80% of IT output is exported, which makes the sector very vulnerable to demand shocks in the world economy. The combination of worldwide rapid internet growth along with rising demand for computing skills created an unprecedented demand for Indian IT services. From 1998, IT exports and employment doubled in a span of just 2 years. The development of this knowledge-intensive industry demanded a new set of technical skills such as programming, debugging, and data analysis that are relevant for software development. Labor shortage stems from the fact that the IT industry requires people with programming and other technical skills, typically attained through pursuing certain types of college education that takes time. While the last 2 decades have witnessed a worldwide expansion of IT and consequent increase in demand for computing skills, this expansion has been disproportionately larger for India than for any other country in the world. The important characteristic of Indian services exports is that more than half of all revenue from services exports comes from a single sector, IT, and IT-enabled services. Furthermore, the proportion of IT internal business services has been consistently higher for India compared with any other developing country. Meanwhile, the first big expansion of IT exports in India occurred during the late 90s and the early 20s. As demand for Indian IT expanded, catapulted by the technological progress and demand shocks in the late 90s, wages and employment rose in the IT sector. Furthermore, with the expansion in Indian IT exports, Indian IT employment kept on increasing. Responding to rising IT employment opportunities Engineering enrollment started responding after 2000. Rising IT wages led to increasing demand for engineering education, and the IT boom itself led to aggregate improvement in welfare in India, but there were large inequalities in welfare depending on where a person was born, the regional availability of education, location of IT jobs, and cost of migration. Creating access to higher education in less developed regions reduces the inequality in welfare induced by the IT boom. One common argument put forward for the success of IT or service more broadly, compared with manufacturing in India, is the lack of labor market regulation by the state in the service sector. The most important initiative by the central government was the establishment of Software Technology Parks of India, a society for the promotion of software exports in 1991. STPI acts as a single window in providing services to software exporters, including statutory services, data communication services, incubation facilities, and training and value-added services. Government involvement in the Indian IT industry through various export development and export marketing support programs, broadly construed as export promotion policies through promotional events such as trade fairs, exporter training, technical assistance, information on trade finance, and assistance with logistics, custom requirements, packaging, and pricing. Subsequently, there could be multiple forms of government intervention. One would be to build colleges directly in poor regions that have few private colleges. Another would be to provide subsidies to students from less developed districts to study in private colleges outside their district. In India, there have been many instances of the first form of intervention, but no records of the second form of intervention. Since the majority of the IT output is exported, the level of employment in the IT sector is mostly driven by the exposure to outside demand for IT. Public colleges respond positively to both IT employment opportunities and the level of development of a region, but the effects are heterogeneous. In poorer districts, the capacity of public colleges was also utilized better than that of private colleges. In India, the IT sector has turned out to employ more women relative to other traditional sectors. State colleges have been more successful in utilizing capacity at all women and minority colleges in poorer districts. Only 30% of students enrolled in colleges find campus placement. Public, private, separate and mixed-gender colleges seem to have similar performance when it comes to student placement. The success in placing students does not differ by the type of college. The third topic is about labor market policy responses amid globalization, with the case of South Africa. The South African economy is one marred in a long-run, low-level growth trap which has entranced high level of structural unemployment. For South Africa, the real economic impact has been most powerfully felt in the labor market, with current and future employment threatened through these shocks. In the post-apartheid period in South Africa, policymakers have employed three major active labor market policies to tackle both the long-term structural malady and the adverse effects of exogenous global shock. The key economic challenge facing South Africa is its high level of unemployment. Thus, the country has the highest employment rates in the world. While unemployment is primarily a structural problem, South Africa's integration into the global marketplace has exposed it to global shocks. Two key points emerge from the problem: the process of deindustrialization and the inability of South African economy to experience growth-inducing structural transformation. South Africa's demand-side labor market responses to high cultural unemployment using three prominent ALMPS. Job retraining scheme was designed as a short-term policy response specifically to counteract unemployment driven by the 2008 global crisis. Meanwhile, both the public employment and wage subsidy programs are long-term policy responses to unemployment as a structural constraint in an economy unable to generate sufficient levels of sustainable employment. The primary objective of the job retraining scheme was to reduce job losses arising out of the global crisis. The key challenges of the job retraining scheme include low numbers of workers benefiting from the scheme, complex multi-party design of the scheme, inadequate capacity of training agency to effectively implement the scheme, lack of understanding of the scheme by potential users, and the risk to the worker. The public employment scheme aims to provide income and therefore poverty relief through temporary work placement for the unemployed. The public employment scheme has faced a number of challenges including balancing trade-off between goals, inability to convert work opportunities to employment, concerns about corruption, and poor monitoring and evaluation. On the other hand, the wage subsidy scheme aims to stimulate the employment of 18 to 29 years olds in the formal sector by reducing the perceived risk and costs associated with hiring younger workers. In order to improve the policy, there is a need for a systematic program aimed at disseminating information about the wage subsidy. Subsequently, one of the goals of the wage subsidy is to expose young people to the workplace in order to enhance their future employability. The public employment scheme has by far the highest cost per beneficiary, and it also creates a large number of work opportunities. Furthermore, the job retraining scheme appears to be the less successful of the ALMPs evaluated. On the other hand, the most successful of the schemes appears to be the wage subsidy scheme. The last topic is about the policy to mitigate the effects of the 2008 global crisis on textile, clothing, leather, and footwear jobs in Morocco. The response to the global crisis of 2008 by the Moroccan government focuses on the rational implementation and effects of this policy on the resilience of firms, employment and workers in the textile, clothing, leather and footwear sector. Moroccan government decided to take preventive measures and set up a strategic watch committee in 2009. The main actions decided by the SWC were focused on three objectives: protecting and promoting employment in TCLF and automotive equipment sectors exporting companies, preserving tourism, and maintaining fund transfer from Moroccans living abroad. Meanwhile, the agreed measures were implemented from February 2009 onward. The 2008 global crisis and the subsequent measures undertaken by the SWC in 2009 intervened in a context marked by two factors: a significant improvement in the labor force education level, an important number of entrepreneurs and workers involved in diversified formal and informal production units. Meanwhile, education is progressing and the impact of its improvement on the labor force structure became significant. Higher quality standards requirements in the TCLF sector's global value chains have led the Moroccan TCLF exporting firms to adjust their recruitment strategies in order to hire a more educated workforce. During the 60s and 70s, Morocco's industrial policy relied on public and national private investors to build a modern integrated TCLF sector. However, a new model of integration into the globalized value chain emerged, which introduces new functions into clothing firms' production processes. The economic crisis of 2008 exacerbated the financial vulnerability of locally owned small and medium-sized TCLF firms. For the Moroccan TCLF sector, the global crisis was perceived as presenting a risk of a significant drop in external demand addressed to Moroccan producers. The impact of the decline in orders addressed to Moroccan producers differs from firm to firm, depending on its integration and its position in the value chain, which includes processing, co-contracting, finished product selection, and platforms. Furthermore, the 2008 crisis also affected the quality of jobs and on wages. The legal framework for the measures adopted by the SWC has been established by agreements signed between the government and the interested parties. The framework of public policies prior to the measures adopted by the SWC, including industrial policy to improve firms' competitiveness, as well as employment and labor force policies. Meanwhile, the schemes put in place by the SWC in 2009 include wage cost reduction, workers training, mobilization of funding and hedging of exporter financial risk, and support for market diversification. In order to be eligible for these measures, TCLF companies had to fulfill several requirements. Okay, so that's our presentation. Thank you for listening.